Good afternoon and welcome to the Alabama Department of Public Health's Training Network. Today our program is Addressing Disaster and Emergency Stress Beyond First Responders, Implications for the Individuals, Families, and Workplace. We're glad to be able to bring you this program from the South Central Center for Public Health Preparedness in partnership with the Alabama Department of Public Health. The South Central Center for Public Health Preparedness is a partnership of the state health departments in Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and the schools of public health at UAB, UAMS, and Tulane University, with funding from the CDC to make this possible. When you go to the Alabama Department of Public Health's website, adph.org, and go to the site for the registration, you'll find the handouts for the program today. In addition to the handouts is an intensive list for resources. This resource has the one-page bibliography as well as list sites of websites that would be important for you to do as follow-up for the program. And lastly, you will find the evaluation for the program. Now, you may do the online evaluation or you may print it and fax it directly to Tulane, whichever is easiest for you. But please complete that evaluation part for our program so that we can use that to make future programs even better. As always, we'll have a 1-800 line, and that number, 1-800-946-6307, is open from now until the end of the program. At any time, if you have questions, please feel free to call that number and we'll have your questions. If you would prefer not to call but would still have a question, you may certainly email those questions, and that address is at the bottom of the screen. So we really do encourage your participation as far as the questions and interactions go for the program. We have some certain objectives for today's program, and those objectives are: be familiar with the nature of stressors for disaster workers who are not first responders. Be able to list the individual, family, and workplace impacts of these stressors. Be familiar with potential strategies for reducing and/or intervening adverse stress reactions. Today we are very honored to have with us Dr. Flynn. Dr. Flynn is a retired admiral, rear admiral, as well as assistant surgeon general. So we are just thrilled that you are able to be with us today. And currently you are a professor at the Uniformed Services University of Health, which is our military institution, right?
That's correct.
And again, this is a trip down from Maryland for you down to Alabama. So we hope you'll have a pleasant time while you're down here in the South.
Thank you.
You know, also joining us today on the program by telephone will be Father Venn. And Father Venn is a true survivor, as we would say it. He has a history of fleeing from Vietnam during the war, being a survivor there, and most recently, all the work he's done in Louisiana with Katrina. And Father Venn is of the Mary Queen of Vietnam Catholic Church there in New Orleans. So he'll be joining us later on the program on the call.
Great.
Dr. Flynn, before the program, we were talking about the fact that we've had so many natural disasters, the hurricane I just mentioned, and we often think about the fact that responders, those first responders, we need to make sure that they're taken care of mentally as well as physically. But we're not always thinking about those family members or the regular person on the street or just someone who is barely associated with it. But this program today will really be addressing that as well, correct?
That's correct.
And I think your experience will help us understand that even more. I mean, you have this firsthand experience of being in Kenya during the bombings, and you went with Vice President Gore to Columbine,
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And you were there helping the students and the staff?
Actually, my trip there was with the Gores to meet with the family members of those people who had been killed. So we got some very powerful experiences with people who had just experienced some of the most horrific losses that we can imagine.
So that was touching all different age groups.
Yes, it was.
But I guess the best well-known in the States disaster then would have been 9/11. And you were there within 48 hours?
Yes.
There in New York City.
Yes, and I'll give some examples of that throughout my talk today.
Oh, good, because I would imagine that would be something that would be very hard to forget, everything that you learned in that program
Right.
or that time period.
Yes.
Well, Dr. Flynn, we are just so excited that you're here today, so at that, I'll just ask you to please take over and talk to us.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you for tuning in today and joining us. This is a topic that I feel passionately about. It really, one of the things that makes this so much fun for me is that this is a professional and intellectual interest of mine, but it's something that I care about very personally as someone who has been a non-first responder, disaster responder for many years, and who has worked with people in lots of different capacities and seen how this work helps them grow and unfortunately sometimes hurts them. So this is very exciting for me to be here with you today and to talk about this topic. Maybe before we start, it might be worth talking a little bit more about some context for today's presentations and why not first responders? Why talk about groups that go beyond first responders? And I certainly would never want to be in a position of saying that we're doing enough or have attended enough to the needs of first responders. And by first responders, we traditionally talk about police, fire, and rescue personnel. They certainly have levels of exposure and work stress and difficulties that are often hard to imagine. And yet, if it's possible, as little as we have paid attention to those important needs of that group, my concern is that we've spent even less time and less attention to the needs of people who are not traditional first responders, people who may have found themselves in a job that they never signed up to do disaster work as part of those jobs, people who may have realized that they may be doing some disaster work but really aren't very well trained for it. So as many needs as we have for first responders, I feel particularly passionately about the need to do better preparation and pay more attention in addition to that population to people who are non-first responders. They really have had less attention, less training with this, less exercise, or less prepared, and as I mentioned, in many cases find themselves doing work in situations that they never anticipated doing. A couple of comments about the context of today's presentation and where this information comes from. I've tried as much as possible to pull together information from the evidence that's evidence-based or at least evidence-informed. I've pulled together material from some of my own writing and from the excellent writings of other people in the field. Over the last couple of years, I've been doing a lot of training of health departments and hospitals with a very talented colleague, Dr. James Schultz from the University of Miami at the Disaster Epidemiology and Emergency Preparedness Centers. And we've been going all over the country and in Canada training health departments and hospitals on disaster behavioral health issues. And some of the information that's incorporated here really comes from our involvement with the students in those programs. People who have had disaster experiences, people who anticipate having those experiences. So, and maybe some of you are listening today who have been in those courses. So this really comes from some of the feedback that we've gotten from you folks. In terms of the format today, I'm going to rely heavily on some PowerPoint slides. I'm going to go through those slides very rapidly. There's a lot of slides. Because you already have access to this information or can easily get it after the presentation, what I'm going to do is go through these fairly quickly. I'm not going to hit every item on every slide. I'm going to highlight those that I think are important. You can go back and look at the issues we don't talk about after the program, or certainly if I haven't covered something that you have an interest in, be glad during our discussion period to go back and address some of those. But with an audience that I understand is maybe almost 4,000 people, it's hard to know what everybody's interest is. So, and finally, what I've tried to do, or I will try to do, is try to give you some examples from my own experience to hopefully make these points come alive and be more relevant. So I thought I would start the presentation with a quote from Nietzsche that I always think about when I think about disaster behavioral health. And that is, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And when you look long into the abyss also looks into you. It really does feel sometimes in disaster work, whether it's a natural disaster or human-caused disaster, that we are fighting the monsters, either human monsters or nature's monsters. And it feels like we're up against overwhelming forces. Part of my work, or the nature of my work for 25 years in disaster mental health, has largely been that when I would go to a disaster site, it would be after the disaster is over. So I never felt much concern for my own physical safety. That was different on 9/11. As you mentioned, Secretary Thompson asked me to go to New York to assess the mental health needs after that. And one of the insidious things about terrorism is we don't know when it's over. We know now when 9/11 started and stopped, but we didn't know that at the time. And I remember being driven into the Holland Tunnel in a federal emergency vehicle. I've been through that tunnel a number of times before, but it was closed to all traffic except for emergency traffic. There was nobody else in the tunnel, and it just seemed that the image that came to my mind reminded me of the Nietzsche quote, that I felt like I was sticking my head in the mouth of a dragon and didn't know whether the dragon was dead or not, and certainly hoping that it was. So that quote really hit home to me very personally. I also think in the abyss part of that quote, when you see the losses that people have and the suffering that people go through in these kinds of situations, it just leaves such an abyss and a hole in communities, in people's lives. And I think when we look at that and we get involved with that, it also causes us to look at our own lives and what we're doing in our own lives and our own vulnerabilities. And it really is one of the reasons I feel so passionately about presentations like today, is that I think we really do have a responsibility to help protect workers as much as we can from helping that abyss not look into them. As an overview of what we're going to talk about today, I've really divided the presentation into 4 parts. The first, we're going to identify really who are disaster responders in the classification that goes beyond first responders. We're going to talk a little bit about the nature of stressors, and then some of the signs of stress that may show up in both individuals, in family situations, and in the workplace. And then it's not all bad news. We're going to talk about some things that we might be able to do individually and as families and in workplaces to deal with some of these situations. First of all, to start out, I'd like to just comment on the complexity of disaster work. It really is a balance between enormously rewarding work and enormously stressful work. I can say in the 25 years of disaster work that I've done, I consider it an enormous privilege, and I'll mention that a little bit later in my comments. But it has been some of the most rewarding and powerful and positive work that I could ever imagine doing. I never imagined being involved in this kind of work when I first started out in the field of mental health. So there are many wonderful, rewarding, and satisfying aspects of it, and I would do it all over again if I had to do it. At the same time, there is that downside. It is enormously stressful, it's exhausting, it's frustrating, and in some situations, as we've seen, it's dangerous. So it really is a mixed bag. It's not for everybody, and I think we have to keep making sure that we focus on the fact that this is a balance between the very positive and rewarding aspects of this work and things that may not be so positive. So in the first part of this afternoon, I'd like to talk about defining the population that we're talking about. I feel a little bit like Jerry Seinfeld. Who are these people? Well, they're us. We're going to be talking about workers who are workers other than first responders. As I mentioned, I feel strongly that if we're going to really address these issues, we need to talk about workers themselves, we need to talk about their families, and we need to talk about the coworkers and supervisors that people have. So more specifically, we're going to talk about kinds of people who get deployed on site in disasters, And in the next slide, I've provided probably a long, illegible list for you to look at of different kinds of folks. This isn't meant to be comprehensive, but just examples of the kinds of people who come to disaster sites physically after these disasters. Federal workers like FEMA, National Disaster Medical System, lots of different kinds of federal workers, people from state and local governments, health departments, people who monitor water, waste, sewage, food, public information folks, highways, utilities, social services. A lot of different kinds of people come offering different kinds of services. Then there are non-governmental people who get contracts to do kind of work of infrastructure assessment and repair, removing damage, providing food, providing ice. Again, these are folks who don't usually do this kind of work, who often find themselves in situations that they really aren't very well prepared. And then there's volunteers from all kinds of organizations, faith-based organizations, Red Cross, and certainly many, many others who provide invaluable services. We're also talking about workers who are deployed to sites other than their normal work sites, but not necessarily a disaster zone. People who may be asked to come and work in command centers or supply and logistics centers. Workers from one part of a state who may be asked to go to another part of the state to fill in for workers who may be deployed to a disaster area. So we're talking about people who don't actually get exposed to the disaster itself physically, but who do disaster work in an environment that's unfamiliar sometimes to them. And then we also talk about people who do their usual jobs, but they do them in a disaster context. So it may mean that they have additional workloads or assigned different tasks to do, but basically they're at their same work sites. Governmental workers from all aspects of government, business leaders, certainly civic leaders and religious leaders who find themselves devoting a lot of their time to dealing with issues of disaster survivors and victims, sometimes at the expense of their routine activities. School personnel, sometimes we don't talk about. Miriam, you and I were talking earlier about the number of students who get moved to different kinds of schools, different schools, and after Hurricane Katrina, and so you have people who are dealing with victims, very real primary victims of these kinds of disasters, who may be 1,000 miles away from them. Again, to give a personal example, after Hurricane Andrew. My wife, who was a guidance counselor at the time, came home one day about 6 months afterwards and said, "Do you have any information about children in disaster, and hurricanes in particular?" And I said, "Well, of course I do." I guess I hadn't done a very good job of telling her what I do for a living, but what had happened was that day she had had 2 students enter her school from South Florida who were children who had been exposed to Hurricane Andrew at the time, and they had been sent to suburban Washington to live with their grandparents while Mom and Dad repaired their house. So here you are 1,000 miles away and you're dealing with very real, very primary disaster victims, and we have seen that happen in record numbers, in record disbursements after Katrina. So I think that pretty dramatically makes the point that you don't have to be in the disaster area itself to be dealing with victims and disaster-related issues. In the workplace, we may be dealing with coworkers who are deployed to the area or left behind to do the work when other workers are deployed to do the routine work, supervisors, employees, and then one group that often doesn't get talked about are clients, customers, patients, students, however you define the people that we serve, depending on your work context. They have ongoing needs also, and so those create in the workplace some very particular stressors that don't get addressed very much. Again, examples of people in the family context who we're talking about. We're talking about spouses of people. We're talking about children of people who work in disasters. We're talking about parents of people. Many of us are dealing with the stressors of aging parents and young children. The sandwich generation metaphor really is a real one. We're dealing with partners. Certainly families come in lots of different constellations now, and close friends also. They are the family members sometimes of people who don't have primary family members. Fairly early in my career, I remember putting together, at the request of FEMA, a couple of pamphlets on disaster stress. One was to help people when they come on site deal with disaster stress while they're there. And then one of the things that I found, and as I talked more with my other FEMA colleagues, I found that it was not an easy transition to go home sometimes to their families and work. So they asked me to do a brochure for them that workers would get as they returned home after disaster work. And I did that, and I think it was a pretty nice piece of work. But when I was out on a disaster not long after that, I was approached by an older woman whom I had gotten to know fairly well after disasters and a number of disasters that we worked together. And she said, "I'm really mad at you, Brian." And I said, "Well, why?" And she said, "You forgot me in here." She said, "You forgot to talk about the people that don't have a family to go home to. When we go and work on disaster site, disaster situations, that becomes our family. And when we go home, we don't go home to a family, we go home to friends, and you neglected to respond to our needs." And I think she's correct. That was an oversight. But I always try to include that to remember that there are people that don't have families to go home to. In the next section of the presentation this afternoon, I'd like to talk a little bit about the nature of stressors themselves in disasters and really try to break those into three different categories: environmental factors, job role factors, and then some of the personal stressors that we might experience. Some of the things, first of all, in terms of environmental factors that we might experience are simply dislocation to a different environment. If we're lucky, the disaster doesn't strike in the place where we live and work. That certainly was not the case for many people after Katrina and Rita, but dislocation to a new place is a stressor. These kinds of events, never seem to happen in nice weather. They have environmental factors of cold, heat, water. I've often said that so much of my career has been going to the nicest places at the worst possible times. They're not easy places to visit or to work in the immediate aftermath of disaster. There may be really austere living conditions. And again, this is one of the areas where training is important. People, for example, in the military train quite a bit in living in austere conditions. People who are employed in the local health department don't. So you find yourselves in the same kind of situations, but really not having the training and experience to deal with these very novel situations. And then certainly sometimes the difficult sensory inputs that we might have, sights that we aren't used to seeing. Again, things like bodies, of smells that we might not be used to experiencing that are very powerful psychologically and stick with us long after. Sounds that we aren't used to hearing, constant sounds of sirens, those kinds of things. There are many kinds of environmental factors that are extreme stressors in disaster situations. Some of the job role stressors are enormously complicated sometimes. There's almost always long hours of work that seem unrelenting. We may be doing things that are a different context than we're used to. A counselor, for example, may be quite used to counseling, but in an office, not in a shelter or at a place where people come to eat. Multiple and conflicting priorities are an extreme stressor. That certainly have been one of my major stressors in the on-site disaster work that I've been involved with. There's always at least a half dozen first priorities that everybody has, and if everything is a first priority, nothing is a first priority. So managing conflicting priorities is a huge stressor for people who want to do a good job, want to be responsive, and are just pulled in lots of different directions. Sometimes these deployments are of unclear duration. I'll talk later on about how important it is to really have an end point for deployment psychologically so that people have a knowledge of when this difficult situation is going to be over. Balancing science and bureaucracy and politics is a stressor. Those of us who come from a more scientific background sometimes have a very tough time in disasters, knowing that all the decisions we make aren't going to be made on the basis of science. They're going to be made realistically on the basis of politics, of funding, and having to make those kinds of compromises and balancing those kinds of different priorities and stressors and pressures are sometimes pretty stressful. The response of those that we've come to help sometimes is not what we would expect. I'm glad to say that in most of the disaster work that I've done, one of the real rewards has been the reaction of the people that have come to help. They're often very appreciative, and you can see the results of your work, but that's not always the case. I remember after Hurricane Andrew, there was a lot of animosity toward federal workers there, and I was driving a car that had a placard in the window that had a federal emergency vehicle in it, and one night all 4 tires were slashed just because I had forgotten to take that placard out of the window. So sometimes the people that come to help don't receive the kind of reception that we would hope from the people that we've come to serve. And there also is kind of a constant struggle between organizations, either within organizations and between them, on the disaster side of who's got authority, who's got priority, who's got the money, who's more important, who can make decisions, and that's another stressor that kind of goes with the experience. Some of the personal stressors that are very common in working in disaster situations. You'll hear me mention a couple of times just overwork and fatigue and not sleeping properly. I mean, these are exhausting kinds of experiences. I think we sometimes underestimate the health and psychological health consequences of extreme fatigue. Changes in eating and drinking behavior. Again, most of us have a routine that we're in terms of what we eat, when we eat. Hopefully that's a healthy eating pattern that often gets changed. You don't know when you're going to eat your next meal. You don't know what it might be. There's never any shortage of caffeine and sugar in disaster sites, so you're sometimes eating and drinking the things that we shouldn't be drinking. We may have been exposed to situations that may adversely impact our health, smoke that makes us cough, or different chemical agents or toxic agents that may give us rashes or expose us to even more difficult and life-threatening kinds of health consequences. Sometimes there's an existential conflict that comes on a very personal level of how could this happen? How could innocent people be hurt like this? You know, is there anything that I as a Red Cross worker, as I as a government worker, or I as a clergy person could ever do to make this right? And will I ever be up to the task? So these very existential kinds of conflicts and questions sometimes come, and then certainly role conflict, which is really at the base of the topic today, is we often feel conflicted. We want to do our job role, but we also want to do our family role at the same time, and the pulls between those kinds of desires and needs often create very personalized kinds of stress. The third part of the presentation, I'd like to talk about signs of stress. This isn't a stress management course, but I thought it might be helpful just to identify some of the signs of stress that are very common. I usually like to talk about these in 5 different dimensions: physical, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and spiritual. Most people, I guess, have had some kind of exposure to stress management theory and practice, and if you have, you've certainly been exposed to the first 4 of those. You may not have been exposed to issues of spiritual dimension. So let me just take a moment to talk about why I've added that here, and it really has absolutely nothing to do with personal belief in this, but it certainly has been my experience in 25 years of disaster work that for huge numbers of people in this culture and in cultures all around the world where I've been, the spiritual dimension of stress is an important one. When people experience really horrific kinds of experiences, they tend to make sense of that through the lens of their religious beliefs. When somebody seeks help after one of these kinds of events, they're going to go, in many cases, to someone in the faith community long before they come to a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a social worker for that kind of help. And the social support that's provided by the faith community during the recovery period is often extraordinarily important in people's psychological and physical and economic recovery. So I am assuming that you would not be watching the broadcast today if you don't have some kind of role in disaster preparedness or response or anticipate having one. So the reason it's in here is that to help reinforce the importance of that to so many people. And the reality is that if we don't appreciate this dynamic and fully incorporate the faith community in our planning and in our preparedness and response, then we're really fighting this psychological battle with one hand tied behind our back. It's really critical. And that's why I'm so pleased that Father Wynn's going to be joining us after I speak, because he certainly has more authority, experience, and credibility in that community than I do, and I'm very anxious to meet him, at least telephonically, and to share some experiences with him. So let me just kind of very briefly go over some of the signs that you might see in these 5 different domains in terms of disaster stressors. First, physically, there's a lot of physical signs of stress that are identified in the slide that you're looking at now. I won't go over them. They're fairly self-explanatory. I would say that the good news on this is not all of us experience all of these things all the time. There are certain protective factors that we have, certain risk factors that we have that may make us more or less vulnerable. I can tell you, for me, one of the first physical signs of stress is gastrointestinal upset. I begin to get nauseous. I develop diarrhea. I've done it enough in enough kind of situations and disasters where I know it's not the food, it's not the water, it's my stress level. For other people, it might be headaches. It's very common to have a headache as a first physiological sign of stress. It's not for me. You know, I honestly can't remember the last time I had a headache that wasn't alcohol-induced, but that's not what you brought me here to talk about today. So that's another project, another topic. Some of the emotional signs of stress that we might witness or experience include certainly fear and anxiety, grief and guilt. Guilt is an interesting dynamic in this kind of work because it kind of goes with the territory. The definition of a disaster is a situation where the needs exceed our resources. It wouldn't be called a disaster if that wasn't the case. So we're constantly confronted with things that aren't getting done and not being done well, or aren't being done in a timely manner, or aren't being done with the quality that we would like to bring to the task. And when you feel some pride in your work and you can't meet those expectations, then guilt is the process. So guilt is a very common kind of phenomena in disaster workers in addition to primary victims. I'd also like to mention things like crying easily. I'm going to mention in a little while some of the cultural aspects of this, and different forms of expressing grief and distress are very culturally determined. But even people who are very stoic in disaster and emergency situations will find themselves getting teary and crying very easily at what may seem to be situations that they wouldn't. I gotta confess that happens to me a lot. It's not stress related, it's because I'm Irish. It's in my DNA. I cry easily as an Irishman. You know, when I see a sad commercial or see the bottom of that Guinness glass or whatever, these are occasions for tears. It is something, as I said, that's culturally determined. When I went to Africa after the embassy bombings, one of the things that I learned was that in Kenyan culture, it's a very strong social taboo for men to cry. There. So I saw the other end of the spectrum in a very serious kind of way. I gave you the Irish analogy in a half humorous way, but it's a serious issue. I spoke with one very high government official there who I won't identify, who was very concerned about the fact that he had cried after the bombings, and not only had he cried, he had been caught on television crying, and he was so concerned about this that he was wondering whether he was going to be able to continue to function in his role because of that. So it's a way of kind of introducing a topic I'll talk more about later, is the importance of understanding culture and what's culturally acceptable and what isn't. I'd also, in this area I'd like to talk a little bit about humor, because I think it's a very complicated and important aspect to talk about. I think humor is very important. It's part of the fabric of a healthy life. What you find in disaster situations, and you find this with first responders and other disaster workers, is that the humor becomes gallows humor, or sick humor. It's humor that's at the expense of the victim. It's a fairly simple psychological phenomenon that's occurring. It's a psychological distancing from the people that we're serving. If we see them as less than human or different than us or as objects, then maybe we aren't as vulnerable to the kinds of losses and pain that they may be experiencing. So what you'll see is humor coming up that is sometimes called sick humor, dark humor, gallows humor. A couple of characteristics of that. One is it's important to know that it's a sign of stress when you see it in yourself and in workers. The other thing is it works. It does relieve stress, and it's important to know that. People have different views on this. I can tell you what my view is on it, is that I really think it's okay. I don't try to stop that in situations where I talk about that. But what I always talk about is the importance of really containing that in the work culture, the immediate work environment that you're working in, where you're working with people who know the stressors, know the work culture, and never participate in that kind of humor outside that culture, or certainly not in front of victims or even other workers who don't understand the kind of nature and stress of your work. You've been having a hard day and you go out and have a glass of wine with dinner and this humor begins to emerge, I advise people to nip it in the bud. Stop it immediately. You never know who's going to be in the booth behind you. It might be somebody who's lost a family member. It might be the governor's chief of staff. You never know who this might be. And whatever else disasters are, they give us almost an unlimited set of career-ending opportunities, and the inappropriate use of humor is one of those. I have seen people's careers get severely sidetracked because of the inappropriate use of humor. So it's something to think about and be aware of. It's an important and complicated part of disaster work. Some of the cognitive signs of stress that I think are worth taking a couple of minutes to talk about. These in some ways may be some of the most important. When we're faced with severe stress, one of the things that happens sometimes is the activation of this very primitive biological system of fight, flight, or freeze response that worked great for us when we were living in caves and being chased by lions, but sometimes doesn't work as well in situations where we aren't facing that kind of direct threat. Part of that involuntary biological response is that it diminishes higher level cognitive functioning. When you're being chased by the lion, we didn't need to think much about that. But the kinds of stressors that we face in the kind of work that we're talking about today, what's the primary skill that gets us out of these stresses? It's creative problem solving. It's the very things that require good cognitive functioning, and that is directly biologically impaired by the stress response. So you may see things like memory loss. There's a fancy word called anomia for something that everybody has experienced. It's inability to name familiar people or objects in our environment. And you see that all the time with disaster victims who can't retrieve the word pencil or chair, words that they've known since they were 3 years old and just can't retrieve. Concentration difficulties, confusing trivia with minor issues, reduced attention span, a whole variety of cognitive impacts that really do inhibit our problem solving. Some of the behavioral aspects of stress that are common, sleep problems are very common. One of the most common stress-related sleep problems is being able to go to sleep okay, but not stay asleep. That early morning awakening that occurs at 2 o'clock in the morning, where you begin ruminating about what you're worried about and then can't get back to sleep. Or actually being able to sleep through the night, but just feeling unrested, unrenewed. You're not sleeping at the level that provides rejuvenation. Changes in eating habit, ritualistic behavior. Again, that's a technical. Using that in the technical term, that's behavior that is repetitive and non-productive. It's behavior that just gets caught in a loop, that people can't stop doing the same thing that they were doing, and it's really not getting them anywhere. And certainly substance abuse is something that we want to be careful about. In the spiritual dimensions, often people experience a crisis of faith after these kinds of situations. How could God allow this to happen? How could God allow innocent children in a school in Colorado to be murdered at will? So people really begin to have a crisis of faith sometimes. They get angry at God. And for people who have strong religious beliefs, this is not something that's easily tolerated or easily sustained. So what happens lots of times, and one of the reasons I bring it up here, is that anger toward God really gets generalized toward anybody else who is an authority figure. Anybody that victims see as somebody who perceive as having some kind of authority becomes an appropriate target for their anger. So if you've got a shirt that says so-and-so's health department or so-and-so hospital or FEMA or SAMHSA or the Red Cross, you are very likely to become the object of people's displaced anger because they cannot find it in their hearts and their belief systems to blame God for this. So again, I'd be very anxious, eager to hear Father Wynn's comments on this phenomenon also. Some of the longer term effects that we may see of stress that are disaster related include nightmares, intrusive thoughts that come unexpected, unbidden, and frighten us because we didn't expect them coming. Relationship problems, decreased libido or sexual interest, being overly critical and blaming people, and then there's an increasing science based on our diminished immune response under prolonged stress. There really are a whole number of illnesses and physical problems that do occur because of prolonged and significant stress, and we're learning more and more about those all the time. I'd like to talk specifically now about stress in families and talk a little bit about the way these kinds of stressors manifest themselves before, during, and after disaster situations. Before a disaster happens, there is often tension in families, anger about the deployment happening in themselves. Why is it my husband or my wife that's being chosen to have to leave the family and do that? Anger about the other responsibilities that the remaining family members are going to have to assume while the person who is doing the disaster work gets deployed. Fear on everybody's side that there will be injury or safety or some kind of loss. Then there's strong emotions that sometimes result from the uncertainty about when the deployment's going to start. It's very frustrating for people to be told on Monday you're going to be sent to a certain place to do this, and then, well, no, that's not going to happen. Maybe it'll happen in a week. So that kind of uncertainty about when you're going to be deployed, what's the deployment going to be like, how long are you going to be deployed. Then there's also just problems that are created if families just deny the importance of any of this, refuse to talk about it, refuse to plan for it. So those are some of the things that happen before an event. The next slide has some stressors listed for during disasters that family experience. Again, fatigue that results and frustration that results over the added responsibilities that family members have, fear for the safety of loved ones, discomfort in the new roles. Maybe the person who stays home, is not the one that usually pays the bills, and now that person has to do that. So that kind of level of stress. And then disappointment over missed events and obligations and family landmarks. I took a little bit of liberty in designing this slide. The pictures on that slide are of my grandson, 4-year-old grandson, Matthew, and I put that in there as a reminder that in my life, I've certainly, because of the work, had to miss a lot of family kind of events, and it's tough for me, it's tough for everyone in the family. So thinking when I did this is a great opportunity for me. I get to talk about a topic that I feel passionately about to a whole lot of people and show pictures of my grandson at the same time. So is this a great country or what? Some stresses in the family that may occur after a disaster. Reasserting the old roles. Roles change, as we talked about, when people are off on disaster work, and kind of reestablishing the old order sometimes is tense. Again, fatigue on everybody's side. I don't think we really appreciate the role that just pure fatigue plays on our problem solving and negotiation abilities. Conflicting expectations of what people want and need when they get home. I know a lot of my FEMA colleagues used to tell the stories about how when they came back after deployment, after many weeks, the first thing that they wanted to do was have a home-cooked meal at the kitchen table, and the first thing their spouse wanted to do was go out to dinner. So, you know, these are sometimes minor issues, but the meshing of the worker responsibilities or needs and wishes and the families may be difficult. Balancing work and family reentry. People want to re-enter into the family and get back to work at the same time, and sometimes that creates some problems. And then stress reactions, like we talked about, may be found on everyone's part. I'm going to do the same kind of analysis for the workplace, identify some stressors that we may see before, during, and after disaster events. Before disasters happen in the workplace, there's often stress that just occurs because of planning for and negotiating shifting workloads. That's not a nice thing to have to consider, taking on more work, leaving your work. You may have fewer people to do the work, and being confronted with that reality before something happens can be stressful. Also, disasters never seem to happen at good times in the work cycle. It's always, you know, when you're most busy, or right at the end of the fiscal year when the budgets are due, or whatever the crisis is in your workplace. They never seem to happen at good times. And then good planning and preparedness takes away resources from ongoing work. That's a reality. I have another very strong bias of mine, is that both individually and organizationally, planning and preparation is very important. Organizations need to plan for disasters, what that means for their organization, what it means for their workers. But to do that takes away from the existing work. And I don't know of many work sites or organizations that have not enough work to do. So it's always a tough balancing act here. As I mentioned, Dr. Schultz and I have been doing a lot of training in hospitals, and it's fascinating. Hospitals are putting a lot of effort into disaster and emergency training in this country and in Canada. Most of it tends to be in technology and procedural kinds of things. They really are not well prepared to deal with the psychological or the behavioral health components of this. And even getting people to be available for training to talk about this is tough. In our medical system, where you have billable hours, where you have heavy competition, just getting people away from their normal workloads to do this kind of preparation and training and planning is often quite difficult. During a disaster, some of the workload stressors include, you know, just managing this changed and expanded workload that we talked about, and different reporting relationships that may occur. Potential loss of expertise. If you're a local health department and you have 2 epidemiologists and they've been sent to a disaster, then who does the ongoing work? So you may lose critical expertise in a work site. You may not know how long this is going to go on, or how long your workers are going to be deployed. So planning for, do I hire new people? Do I hire temporary people? Do I readjust workloads gets to be a stressor. And then there's sometimes this perception that occurs that the worker who's out doing the job, you know, is getting to do all the interesting and exciting and glory attracting kinds of things, and the workers that are left there are just left to do the scut work and the work that nobody wants to do. And so there's animosity that sometimes emerges in that kind of situation. Again, some of the issues that may arise after a disaster happens. We may have missed deadlines, people calling in sick, increased absenteeism, irritability and anger. Again, some of these issues of diminished cognitive function we talked about concentration difficulties and quality of decision making. There's also a feeling sometimes that by workers who will return, that nobody really understood what I went through and how difficult that was and the price that I had to pay. So there are a lot of stressors after a disaster. So to conclude the presentation today, what I'd like to do again is take these three domains of individual, family, and workplace and talk about some strategies that we might evoke in each of those domains. So for individuals, there are a few things that we can do, I think, before being engaged in disaster work that can help us. We can take good care of ourselves. We can anticipate what the issues are. We need to know our strengths and vulnerabilities. I have a belief that there is room for everybody in disaster work, but not everybody ought to be doing every job. The people who go on disaster sites, may or may not be the right people to do that. And so there's knowing what strengths and vulnerabilities are important. Getting physically, emotionally, and vocationally prepared. Preparation does make a difference. And if you are healthy, and well prepared physically, emotionally, and vocationally, then I think you tend to be better off in these situations and less vulnerable to adverse consequences of stress. And training does work. Getting trained to deal with the kinds of adversity that you might expect really is important and does make a difference. Maintaining reasonable work hours. That's one of the toughest things to do in a disaster situation, but it's extraordinarily important. People do need to have rest and respite from their disaster work, so having definite work hours and shifts and sticking to that's important. Again, making sure that we attend to rest and eating cycles and exercise, keeping contact with home, whether that's real or symbolic. Take pictures of your loved ones with you. Take remembrances so that in some ways they're there with you. If possible, have phone contact. Make some provision for private time. That's something that all of us need. I know for me, I got to have that. I have to have some private time to myself in every day. It doesn't have to be a long time, but that's often tough to secure in a disaster situation. Talking to somebody who understands is important. Again, this is very unique kind of work, so talking to people who have been through it is often helpful. And having somebody to look after you and self-monitor is important. Having an endpoint, as I said, is important. Knowing that there will be a definite time when you will be leaving this disaster work and returning to home and returning to your normal duties is very important. For individuals, again, I think there's some things that we can do in terms of self-care. Using a buddy system. In the best of all possible worlds, there are three sets of eyes looking at us when we're doing disaster work. Our own eyes, we're looking at ourselves, self-monitoring. We have a supervisory or command structure that's looking at us and making sure we're doing okay. And ideally, we got a buddy who knows us, who can be candid with us, and will be able and willing to tell us when we are experiencing stress-related problems that may be creating problems. We also have to advocate for our own needs in these situations. Again, we don't live in an ideal world. In an ideal world, the command or supervisory structure would know what your needs are, and you wouldn't have to ask. But being able and willing to say, I need to take an afternoon off, or I just need to take 10 minutes and walk outside and clear my head. Advocating for your own needs is very important, and people sometimes have a difficult time doing that because of the extreme workloads that people experience. Again, reducing the stressful stimuli as much as possible, staying as far away from the sights and sounds that evoke strong emotions is very helpful, and certainly seeking help if it's needed is the appropriate thing to do. Now, after getting back from deployment, whether it's at the disaster scene or someplace else, I think there's some first thing first suggestions that I'd like to share with you. One is get rest and sleep. I've said probably more times than I need to that these are such exhausting kinds of situations that people do need to physically replenish and restore themselves through rest and sleep. Taking time with friends and families is important. Pay attention and take care of any kind of health concerns that may have emerged that you think may have been exacerbated or caused by your work in a disaster situation. Take care of the basic personal needs that need to be taken care of, the lawn mowing, the grass mowing, the paying the bills, those kinds of things. And then I think even in these very early stages, thinking about what your experience has been and what it's meant for you personally and professionally is important to do. Also, when you get back to home and work, I think, again, advocacy for your own needs is important. Being tolerant and understanding of other people. Showing appreciation to others. It's another strong bias of mine, is that the people at home and the people at work are just as much a part of a disaster response as the people that go unseen. And so I think showing appreciation and recognizing that is very important. And then finally, and maybe the most important aspect of this, is I think we have an opportunity and, in fact, an obligation to use these kinds of experiences to change our own lives in positive ways. I really feel that I have been enormously privileged to be able to do disaster work over a number of period of years. I consider it an honor and a privilege to be with people and with communities in their toughest times, in their darkest hours when they have lost the most. It's just, I can't say it any more strongly than the kind of privilege and honor that I feel to have been able to do that. But I think with that privilege comes some responsibilities. One is to be as well prepared to provide help when we're offered that opportunity to be with people in these toughest times. And the other responsibility is I think we need to use that opportunity, that exposure, in a way of honoring the loss, of bearing witness to the suffering, of honoring the horrific things that people have lost by changing our own lives in positive ways based on that experience. I can tell you, after coming back from Oklahoma City, I never looked at my coworkers the same again. This was a federal building. I was a federal worker. These people were like me. They just went to work in the morning. They put their children in what they thought was safe, high-quality daycare, and those children were killed. I found a work environment there after Oklahoma City and after 9/11 in New York, where people just worked together in ways that are just almost unimaginable. So I think I looked at the workplace and my colleagues very differently after that. Miriam, as you mentioned, I had the honor of accompanying Vice President Mrs. Gore to Columbine to meet with the families of those who had been killed. And that was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. I'll never forget that. I learned a lot about grief and bereavement that day that actually would be fun to, interesting maybe to talk about it some other time. We don't have the time here today, but you know, I don't think I ever looked at my own kids the same way as I did after that. When you see how quickly and arbitrarily your most cherished loved ones can be taken away from you, I think we have an obligation to use that kind of exposure and experience to get our priorities straight and to change our own lives in positive ways. Some of the strategies that might be helpful for families after disasters is, before disasters, is to talk and think about a number of things that might happen. I'm a strong believer in just even having a little bit of conversation and talking about these things can help reduce some stress. So talk about what the nature of the work might be for the person who might be deployed so that family members have an understanding of what that might be. Seek agreement and consensus on what kinds of risk levels and conditions are okay for the families and what are not. And this is serious business. I mean, some of this work really doesn't involve much personal risk, but some of it does. And I think family members need to be involved in those kinds of decisions. We need to consider the potential adverse medical and psychosocial consequences of this. Family members need to know both those risks and rewards that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, and have some consensus, I think. And having a family disaster and deployment plan is critical. It's something that too few of us do, but actually planning as a family about what you're going to do in a disaster or about what the family is going to do when a family member is deployed is critical. It provides a wonderful opportunity not to just get better prepared as a family, but to talk about these kinds of issues, to help share family values and And in the trainings that I've mentioned that I've been doing around the country, sometimes I'll ask the folks how many people in the class or the audience have an individual or family disaster plan, and I have yet to have more than 20% of the people raise their hands. So I think that's something we all need to attend to much more seriously. Some of the things that families can do during a deployment are to maintain contact with the person that's deployed. Again, sometimes that can't be done, but when that is possible, I think that's very helpful. Family members ought to seek and utilize social supports. We know from the literature that social support before, during, and after disasters is very important for primary victims and survivors. It's also important for workers. Maintain structure and routine as much as possible, and then also practice self-care. Some things to remember when people come back to their families. I've really drawn much of this material from the very exciting program called Courage to Care, which is an initiative of the Center for Studies of Traumatic Stress at Uniformed Services University, where I'm affiliated. And we've been developing a number of materials, not just for military families, but for other disaster situations. And we have some, I think, very good material about homecomings and what homecomings mean and how complicated they sometimes are. So some of the things I'm going to say are really largely based on those materials. But I think we need to remember that homecoming is more of a process than an event. And that connection really does take place over a period of time. Also that when homecoming represents return to safety and security and back to normal, that the environments that are at home versus the disaster area are often quite different and take some time to adjust to by the people who are returning. It's also important to remember, as we've mentioned somewhat before, is that when the person who's deployed was gone, other people took over their work and their responsibilities in the families, and so reasserting existing or previous roles needs to be negotiated, and it really calls for patience on everyone's side during this period. And we all want this to be accomplished and things get back to normal tomorrow, and it can't be tomorrow, so we need to go slow on these kind of situations and remember that these kinds of things do take time. I would also mention that I think it's important that we take care when we return from these kinds of experiences, take care in how we talk about them. Talking about disaster experiences really is a very personal and delicate situation, so we want to be, as guidance to all of us, more focused on listening than in talking. But as we talk about what we have experienced, I think we need to take extreme care. Sometimes when we're in disaster situations, we talk about things very casually that are upsetting to people in the general population or our families. You know, we may talk routinely about bodies or body parts or the disposition of remains, those kinds of things. That's not what normal people talk about most of the time in family situations or in work situations. So we have to be very careful that we don't traumatize, re-traumatize, or even unnecessarily stress people by talking about these kinds of things in ways that may be upsetting. I think that's particularly important in talking about our experiences in front of children. We really don't want to create a situation where children become frightened or traumatized by hearing the kinds of stories and experiences that we may have had. It's also, I think, helpful to keep the social calendar for families fairly flexible and unfilled. People's needs change and emerge over time. It's hard to anticipate that before someone comes home. So I think keeping that flexible is important. We also need to understand that children's reactions may not be what we wanted. They may be a little bit distant, a little standoffish. I think we'd all love to be embraced as conquering heroes by our kids coming home, but they have lives, they have feelings about us being gone, and sometimes those initial reactions are not what people had expected. And in general, homecoming and reunions seldom match people's fantasies about what they're going to be like. So I think tempering those kinds of expectations of joyous reunions is sometimes good to help people from, not creating a situation where they're disappointed when they come home. Going now to workplace strategies. I think, again, some things that can and should be done before an event happens include providing an organizational culture that supports people. That may seem like a no-brainer, but I think it's something that we really need to keep reinforcing. People know when they work for organizations that care about them, and they know when organizations don't care about them. I think if we're really going to expect people to do difficult, stressful kinds of work, and we're going to expect them to remain employed, keep functional, and not become casualties, this really has to occur in a context of an organizational culture that is supportive and that values people and that cares about their well-being. I think we also need to be careful about selecting workers for disaster work. As I said earlier, not everybody is suited for this kind of work, but I also believe there's something everybody can do. So really matching temperament, skills, personality, psychological health, medical health, I think are all important factors in identifying who's going to do what kinds of work in disasters. I also think we ought to view stress management as a job skill. If we're going to put people in stressful situations, I think we have an obligation to train them to do that and to measure that. You know, again, I have a lot of biases, as you can probably tell, but one of my biases is that an organization really is not doing its job if they just have an intervention or a referral to an EAP if somebody becomes a psychological casualty. I think dealing with worker stress begins at selection of the people that we're hiring. It continues through how we train them, and I think training people to manage stress is as important a job skill as anything else. If we're going to put people in situations, we need to have a culture that supports people. We need to have a range of interventions that supports people when they're doing this work, and a range of interventions that's helpful to people when they come back. There's not a one-size-fits-all. Again, people have different kinds of needs. Some of that's culturally defined. Some of it is defined by other kinds of factors, but we need to look at this as a continuum of organizational responsibilities. I think it's kind of a no-brainer also, but we need to involve the people who are going to be deployed as workers or working in disasters in our planning and preparedness, not just plan in a top-down kind of way for them. We need to plan with them. Again, some things that the workplace can do before an event include preparing workers for the new kinds of roles, orienting them, training them, giving clarity about what the job is going to be, providing things like go kits. I know that my old organization, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, for their workers deployed in Katrina, had a very extensive go kit that went with them that included not just educational materials for them, for themselves, but for the general public, for themselves, sunscreen, other kinds of things. So I think it was very helpful, but it also made a statement about the organizational caring for the people that it sends out in the field. I think addressing issues like stigma and fitness for duty and security clearances need to be talked about up front. One of the things that was quite difficult in the embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, and this was something that I had not been as acutely aware of before those situations, is that virtually everybody working in those situations at a professional level has a top secret security clearance. If one seeks care for a psychological disorder, you run the risk of jeopardizing that. That's a career trajectory issue. If you lose that security clearance in that kind of context, your career trajectory may be compromised. So identifying where those issues are, I think will do a lot to helping people understand what some of the impediments of people participating in intervention or seeking treatment might be, and how we might help people in those kinds of circumstances. I think we also need to integrate an approach and not just have it be based on referral to an EAP or to your health care provider, but we really need to integrate a plan that talks about the role of EAPs, of health insurance, of supervisors, of organizational policies. For example, if someone returns from a disaster and needs to take some time off to attend to family values. Are they charged leave for that? Are they not charged leave? Again, I think these have major symbolic kinds of importance to people, but they are the kinds of things that if we can determine those before someone's deployed or involved in disaster, we're much further ahead of the game than if we try to figure out those things afterwards. Some of the things that organizations can do during an event are to keep contact with their workers in a situation, provide positive reinforcement both for the workers in the field and those who are returning, and making sure that there's a range of interventions for folks when they come back. Again, having supervisors meet with employees when they come back to talk about their experience, to talk about their expectations is important. To understand and implement psychological first aid, which is very analogous to physical first aid for people who may need it. And if there's some discussion or questions that we may have, we can talk about that in a few minutes. We need to make sure that we screen, refer, and monitor people so that we get them the kind of help and attention that they may need if problems emerge. In concluding the presentation this morning, I just want to make mention of a couple of special considerations that I think are really worth at least just a brief mention of. One is situations in which workers are also victims. This really complicates the situation. We've talked primarily so far of situations where people go from an area that isn't impacted by the disaster to an area that may be impacted. We have a much more complicated situation in terms of work needs, family needs, and stressors when the victims are also workers themselves and live in the area. We have also some special considerations that I think we need to think about beforehand of situations where workers may be potentially exposed to some kind of infectious disease or something that could be communicated to others when they return. Again, that's not typically the situation that we find in disasters, but I think when we begin to think about influenza pandemic, when we begin to think about H5N1, we really need to be thinking quite differently than we have before in many ways. So I think at minimum this needs to be talked about, and we need to make sure that we provide credible information to family members if there is the potential of contamination or contagious disease, and we need to make sure that those family members have available monitoring, assessment, and treatment if needed. And finally, I would mention cultural considerations. It's hugely important. It makes a difference on how people interpret what's happened to them, where people go for their help, how they express distress, how they express hope. And again, I will leave that for some more discussion to Father Wynn to talk about, but it's very important to learn about the importance of culture, to implement culturally competent programs and approaches, because it can make or break a response. Again, I'll give a couple of extreme examples to make the point. I did some work in Samoa. And one of the things that I learned before going to Samoa was that people in Samoa, when they get distressed, tend to laugh as an expression of the discomfort. And when I went there, they were anxious and hearing about some disaster experiences that I had, and as I was telling them more, they began to laugh more. And it was, even knowing that cultural factor was difficult, but because I knew it, I was able to understand, not make inappropriate assumptions about that. I worked in Alaska for a while on some projects up with the Native Alaskans up on up in the Arctic Circle, where a river flowed and flooded out 3 communities out there. I learned that there was a cultural belief in that population that if you talked about bad things happening, you caused them to happen. So preparedness with that population was quite a challenge. So for some cultural groups, it's okay to talk about your problems to other people, and some it's not. In some, it's okay to talk in groups, In some it's not. In some cultural groups it's appropriate to get your care only from a doctor, only from a priest, only from somebody who's the same gender. So we really do need to understand and know these cultural issues, or we can misstep even with the best of intentions in ways that can really compromise the response. So again, I'm looking forward to Reverend Nguyen's comments in that regard. So as a final slide, just to kind of summarize some of the goals that I hope we've accomplished, or at least we want to accomplish in understanding and implementing some of these strategies. We really want to optimize workers' contributions in times of disasters. We want our workers to be able to do their jobs and make a contribution. We also, I'd go back to that second slide that I showed about the balancing act. We want this deployment and this work to be as positive for people as we can be, and it is positive. We want to make sure that it's positive for the workers, their families, and their workplaces as much as we can, and to minimize those kinds of adverse consequences that may come to visit individuals, families, and the workplace because of stressors that might occur. So I think with that I will draw a breath and throw things back to you, Miriam.
Thank you so much. That's given us so much to think about, and the cultural aspects as well. And I'm so glad at this time. Father Vin, are you on the line?
Yes, I am, dear.
I think this would be a perfect time if you would just give us a background, a little bit of why we invited you on this program, some of the interesting parts of the Mary Queen of Vietnam Catholic Church and the work that you've been doing.
Well, I don't know. I'm wondering about why you inviting me. Mary Queen of Vietnam is an all-Vietnamese, all Southeast Asian parish in the eastern part of New Orleans. And all of us had actually due to Katrina. Right now, and our yet still look and leave. So it's a question of how things like how regain entry into their residence. Basically, I think that's the issue.
Part of the discussion that you were giving us, being able to re-enter, actually going and helping those families get their belongings and actually putting them in safe places so that they could re-enter society. What were your thoughts as far as what Dr. Flynn was just saying, some of the stressors? What, as you as a pastor, were some of those stressors that you were having to deal with?
Basically, on everything that's been mentioned, on everything that's been mentioned, I've seen in the population that I way to cope with the enemies, cope with this instinct in my parish. That is not, it was practice interlacing. Once the experience of the practitioners have repeated at least 2 or 3 times from South and 4, then South this country 1975. So for them, this is something that's for you. They know it can always begin again. And really, they see this as a minor setback in the sense that the previous time they never returned to their previous home, but here they could. They believe still could, and are every effort to do so. That's the experiential side. On the philosophical side, we believe in the not always articulated. We believe in the reality of the yin and the yang, meaning that in that of night dawn in. So at the night of belief will come. So in that sense, people are always looking ahead, and so that is connected to the pastoral experience of Christians, that the belief that after the trial, after the death, we will rise again. And so all that help us at this point, help what we're going through.
Father, again, you're talking about the fact that that the people that you're helping had that hope, had that expectation that they were going to be able to go back home again. And I think that's important that it's similar to what you were saying, we wouldn't be able to tell them when it would be over, but in the long run, the hope is that they can go back home. How did you address the fear or the stresses of blaming God? You as the father of the Catholic Church, did you experience people openly telling you that it was God's fault, or why did God let this happen?
We Vietnamese are somewhat stoic in our view of life. We don't question God because normally God does not answer directly. So what we do is we just take whatever is given and then make the best out of it. So I really haven't seen that aspect of it in my culture, where people question God or are angry at God. I have not seen that.
What about some of the stressors that you were we were listening to, as the fatigue and kind of the improper diet? How have you been able to help your church members realize that they need to take a break and take care of themselves?
I do try to, especially with my co-workers, I do try to tell them to take a day off, to take a break. Also to remind them that they know themselves best, and thus they need to take care of themselves. Regarding the diet and all of that, basically it's a situation where whatever we are given we'll take. Whenever the Red Cross Earth emergency van arrives for food, we eat it. So we don't focus on that too much. We only see that as sustenance.
Father, I was some of your early comments were breaking up, at least in the studio here, but I was struck by your comment about the value of having a forward-looking orientation to things, and I couldn't agree more. I think it's so important that we, and it's a very delicate balance of getting people to manage their own issues and crises and solving the immediate problems, but also looking forward in a positive kind of way. I'm not sure whether you mentioned, and we missed here in the studio, any kind of advice or consultation you might have about how to help people in these times of crisis maintain a forward-looking, positive, resilient attitude.
I think first, if I may, to share with you an experience that I just encountered yesterday as I was driving through the community. There was an old man, an elderly man, somewhat sickly, but he was walking around the community collecting tins from roofs and sidings and whatever else, because he has a very large garden. So he's looking forward to rebuilding his garden. So already out there, he's picking up these pieces of tin to work on his garden. So that's the forward-looking aspect that you are speaking of. For me, I try to help my parishioners by setting some goals, bringing about some routines that they were familiar with, like daily mass in the morning. We are back to it now, and so people know that it's almost back to normal now. While we were still quote unquote in exile, their question was when could they return? And my response to them was giving them a date based on some of the information that I had. I told them that we will celebrate our first Mass at the Vietnamese Martyrs Feast, which would be at that point on the 26th of November. So they have something to look forward to. And immediately after that, we are preparing now for the Christmas carols, all of our program for Christmas. And also we have the Vietnamese New Year with the festival on the first weekend of February. So we are preparing ourselves for that now. So people are always looking ahead at some specific events that they can achieve. It gives a certain sense of achievement that they are in control.
That's wonderful examples, and it occurs to me as you talk that not only are these important kind of milestones for people and for example, planting the garden actually gives something constructive for people to do, but virtually all of the things that you talked about are also highly symbolic of the fact that there is a future and that there is a return to normalcy. And one of the things that I didn't mention in the presentation that I feel so strongly about is the importance of symbols and rituals in our healing and moving forward, that the written and spoken word fails us very quickly in these situations, and that we really do need to rely very heavily on symbols and rituals to help us rebuild community solidarity in the sense of future hope. And you've given us some wonderful examples about how to do that in a very in a way that's very religiously and culturally appropriate, it sounds like.
Yes, thank you.
One other question. We've talked about guilt quite a bit today, learning the different sides of guilt. Father Van, I was just wondering if any of the congregation that you've been working with dealt with that grief or that guilt, but yet they almost felt guilty that they were not having more problems than they were.
I don't think right now our people, there are a few. I lost a few parishioners. One directly due to Katrina. We found her at home some 3 or 4 weeks later, dead. And so her relatives were, of course, are struggling now with the guilt of having left her behind, on not maybe feeling that they have not done enough. But in general, in the other aspects, I think the issue is really how can we recover right now. It's that sense of survival. I think guilt would require a little time of reflection. We don't have that time yet.
By saying yet, is this something that you then are planning for, so you'll be able to help them through that? Are you not expecting that? Or?
No, I do expect that, but remember now in our religious tradition, we have confession, we have reconciliation. So ritualistically, as well as sacramentally, we have a way of dealing with that. If there's anything else that comes about, then I guess I have to cross that bridge when I come to it.
Father, I'd be curious in your reflections on, as a priest and as a member of the faith community, really what this has been like for you and your colleagues. In my experience in disasters, you all experience some pretty some extraordinary additional stressors in these kinds of situations, and are called upon to do some pretty extraordinary things. And I've also experienced that sometimes disparate parts of the faith community come together in ways that they often didn't before the disaster, and don't want to put any pressure on you to talk about things you aren't comfortable in talking about, but to the extent to which you could share any information or any reflections on that would, I think, be very interesting to all of us.
Yes, I am quite fortunate to have a number of competent and dedicated assistants who also have a very good sense of humor, and so that help in our work, where it reduces the stress in the sense that we can share our humor, we can joke around, but at the same time we can share our ideas, bounce ideas around, so that I never have to feel that I'm the only one carrying the burden. At the same time, you are correct, the latter part of your statement, that the people are actually pulling together now. We overlook the minor blemishes of life and really look forward to see what we can contribute to rebuild this parish. And I always emphasize the positive aspect of what we are doing, that we now have a chance to deliberately rebuild the parish.
During this pause, I would like to encourage you in the viewing audience, if you have a question for Father Vin, or if you'd like to ask a question to Dr. Flynn, please just feel free to call at this time or email, as we've talked about it before. As far as any other questions that you might have for Father Wynn.
I'm curious, obviously don't know your congregation that well, but I suspect that given some of the history, you're dealing with people who have perhaps been overrepresented in having experienced trauma before this. And again, I'm always interested in the question about what about those people who have experienced prior trauma that sometimes use that experience as a protective factor and come out stronger, and those on the other side of that because of those prior experiences really are much more at risk. And I'm wondering if you have any reflections on that phenomenon in your population, as how prior stress and prior trauma may have influenced people's reaction to this trauma.
Yes, that is very interesting issue that I have found that the people who are in their 60s, in their 70s, who have had the experience of migrating twice, north to South Vietnam and then South Vietnam to the U.S., they seem to cope with that much better because in a way it's almost like they've had their training. I have encountered, actually this morning I've had to deal with a situation of a young man, 26 years old, and heard about another young man, some 19-year-old young man, who could not deal with the situation. And I think part of it was that they did not have the same training, quote unquote, as their elders. So in that sense, their experience really helped them, the older generation.
Thank you.
I think that's a wonderful way to conclude. We can always, as you said before, you mentioned the accountability, that partner, Father Wynn being able to say, look to your elder generation, see what they've gone through, see how they've made it through before. Americans tend to always think that we'll come out on top and we can get through this. And I think this is just one more example of the strong willpower that we're seeing in each community as we're trying to get through this grief process and these disasters that we've had to go through.
I sometimes do a lecture on lessons learned of 25 years of disaster work, and at the top of my list is the resilience of the human spirit. And while dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and clinical depression and suffering and all the adverse consequences we see is a critical part of this. The story of disaster behavioral health, in my experience, is one of hope and one of resilience. And I just am amazed when I see what people go through, and that many don't develop a psychiatric disorder, and they go on to rebuild their lives, as Dr. Wynn said, using those experiences to help prepare them and make them stronger to deal with adversity in the future. It really has reinforced my view of resiliency and the power of hope.
We hope that you've enjoyed this program with us this afternoon, being able to give you a lot of good information, things that you'll need to look for stress indications in times of trouble. We are glad you were able to join us. Please take time to fill out the evaluation, and as I mentioned, you can fill out the evaluation online and send that directly to Tulane or fax it to Tulane, and that information is provided. Some of the future programs that we will have, the next one is Toxic Soup or Not? Hurricane Katrina through the lens of environmental health preparedness, looking at some of the more food issues as we've discussed. And that is Thursday, December the 15th at noon until 1:30. Again, that is Central Time. I'm Miriam Gaines, and I want to thank you for spending this afternoon with us as we've been discussing this important topic. Thank you.